think listening to the three great talks that we've had, there's two words that stand out for me. One is context. Context matters. And the other is relatedness or relationality. And so we are in this context. We're in Stellenbosch, which some people don't always realize is part of the African continent, which has a very long epistemological history of relatedness, which I will bring into the conversation that I would like to draw on, which was developed during my stay in Yale last year in drafting the bulk of this book, Age of Sustainability. It's subtitled Just Transitions in a Complex World. My original title, which the publishers rejected, was Just Transitions in a Complex World, subtitled Reflections of an Enraged Incrementalist. But Routledge was worried that nobody would know what an incrementalist is, which is unfortunate. I suppose if it was Reflections of an Enraged Revolutionary, it might have survived. But I'm trying to, in this book and in my thinking, say, granted everything that we've just heard, complexity accepted, epistemological complexity accepted, ontological complexity accepted, so what? So what, in particular for an African living in the most unequal society in the world and probably one of the most misogynistic? And what does that mean for our theory of change? I'm struck by the preamble of the SDGs, which talks about the aspiration to live in a transformed world. But what does the transition to that transformed world look like, feel like, sense like, especially from a global South or African perspective? And this book really begins with a quote from Bruno Latour, which appears at the end of my last book, which was called Just Transitions, Explorations of Sustainability in an Unfair World. The quote goes like this: we are trapped in a dual excess. We have an excessive fascination for the inertia of socio-technical systems and an excessive fascination for the total, global, and radical nature of the changes that need to be made. The result is a frenetic snail's pace. An apocalypse in slow motion, changing trajectories means more than a mere apocalypse and is more demanding than a mere revolution. But where are the passions for change? And really, that is my question. Where are the patterns for change? Given that we have changing our understanding of the world, given that, especially us Africans living in a relational world in our everyday experience, what does that mean for our understanding of change? John and I and others at the CST have been working with trying to recontextualize transdisciplinary research methodology in the African context. And TD makes a distinction between three types of knowledge: systems knowledge, what exists; target knowledge, what should be, which everybody is very good at in the policy world. But what is really insufficient is transformation knowledge. How do we get from where we are to where we want to be? And that really is our question at CST. And I like the formulation of Rosie Bradotti, the Utrecht-based posthumanist writer. She says, we need a vision that is worthy of the present. So what I've tried to do in this book, and I'm just going to show you the table of contents just to give a sense of what it covers, is it's a kind of neo-Polanyian perspective that connects with an African perspective that is often referred to through the Shona word Ukama. And I know there's Zimbabweans in the room, so this is the wrong pronunciation. But Ukama is the Shona word for relatedness. And it's beyond the word Ubuntu. Ubuntu is relatedness of us as people. Ukama is relatedness of us as people, but to nature, to both animate and inanimate things, but also to the ancestors, which link the past, the present, and the future. So this is a kind of conversation, if you like, between Polanyi is double movement, that while something is happening, something else is happening that we don't fully understand, which becomes more transformative. And the sense of relatedness rooted in a particular context. There are lots of people these days who are writing about transition. Multi-level perspective out of the Dutch context, techno-industrial transitions, Carlota Perez, the Venezuelan economist based in Europe, long-term development cycles by Gore, the economist, deep transitions, Johann Scott and others. In the global south, you have people talking about post-development, a kind of post-neoliberal, post or non-capitalist future, biocentric, post-extractivist. In the south, you have people talking about the crisis of civilization, Björn Vivier or Pachamama, rights of nature, the commons, post and more and particular kinds of post extractivism. In the north, you have people talking about transitions down, degrowth, great transition, great turning, and various others. So what emerges out of our context? How do we think about transition? And for me, a key point of departure was the conversation between posthumanism and the Ukamian perspective out of Southern African philosophy. The posthumanist turn is essentially a critique of the Vitruvian man, perfection. I like the play on perfection, the critique of the perfect white male, alone, symmetrical, etc., to the relational self. The impact of feminism that dismantles that patriarchal perspective, the impact of political ecology, which recontextualizes the individual, and the impact of post-colonial studies, which creates the diversity. And the outcome is the relational self. But Southern African ethics has been talking about relatedness and connectedness long before the posthumanist turn in the Western European context. And so there's a fascinating set of writing in a book by Murovi called African Ethics, an anthology of comparative and applied ethics, which basically argues that the West is catching up with the African philosophies of relatedness. So that's really a deep underlying point of departure for me that results in the first chapter in a reflection on one of the key passions for change, which is often ignored because it's seen as a threat, which is rage. And out of a Fanonist perspective on rage, I argue that we need to liberate it from the way it's been spiritualized, pathologized, psychologized into submission, rather than being seen, as the Greeks did, as a force for change. So really, that's really the basis for what I mainly want to talk about, which is chapter 2. And this really has got, I try and link 4 bodies of knowledge, which are critical for, if you like, developing an understanding of change. One is really meta-theory, and that's really what we've been talking about today. And I'm particularly influenced by the book compiled by Roy Bashkar and colleagues called Meta-Theory for the 21st Century, which tries to bring together the work of Edgar Morin, Roy Bashkar, and Ken Wilber. The second part is to see that as underpinning the work by Brian and Weinocker and Bob Ayers on non-equilibrium economics. The third part is to then connect that to the work on collaboratory governance by Bob Jessup, and the fourth is to connect that to what I think is the progressive agenda for, I don't even know what label to use, for whatever we want to be, which is the commons, commoning and commons economics. So when it comes to meta-theory, what Bashkar and his colleagues have done in constructing this conversation between complexity, critical realism, and integral theory is what they call an integral complex realism, which has got a lot of elements in common with what Gene was ending up with. But I've pulled out 9 key principles from this expanding conversation that happened just before Bashkar died. The first is obvious, and that's been discussed at length this morning, which is non-reductionism. I won't say more. The second is post-formal cognition. Complex adaptive systems, using Rika's phrase and the way Rika thinks about it, goes beyond atomism, i.e. reducing wholes to parts. It also goes beyond systems thinking, i.e. reducing parts to wholes. And it also refers to the ever-changing, in other words, this is my worry with structure, ever-changing relational complexities, including natural, social, and spiritual phenomena. The third is realist ontology, which has already been referred to, beyond the epistemic fallacy, as critical realism calls it. There is a mind-independent reality, in other words. Fourthly, a stratified vision of reality, i.e. irreducible parts, elements, levels, call it what you want. The physiosphere, the biosphere, the neosphere, without assuming that a priori any one of those has more determining impact than any of the others. Fifthly, inter and in particular transdisciplinarity. And for us, transdisciplinarity means co-producing with societal actors solutions to real-world problems that are context-specific. So there's a lots of problems in that statement for the traditional academic, especially the assuming that common sense of societal actors has equal validity to scientific knowledge. Sixthly, unitas multiplex, the non-reduction of interiors to exteriors, modern science, the erasure of particularities, modernity, the reduction of subjectivities to intersubjectivities, postmodernism. All of these are problematic. And the alternative, unitas multiplexus, is the idea of the relative autonomy of the subject, because without that, there's no agency. Seventhly, spirituality matters and is a key element of ethics. The eighth point is homo complexus, the break from essentialism, in other words, the idea that there's only one human nature. What we need is an emancipatory, transformative conception of human agency, which is expressed in complex ways in specific contexts. So that was also a theme that came out. And then finally, obviously, contextual specificity. Context matters, not just as a construction, and nor as a derivative of some categorical imperative, but what is possible in a context-specific way. So for me, this kind of meta-theoretical framework and synthesis with a kind of Ukamian, sub-Saharan African ethical perspective is important for constructing the lenses for rethinking economics. And I don't want to go into that very much. I use Brian's work, Eric Beinocker's work, and in particular Bob Ezra's work, to do what many people in the non-equilibrium world do, which is bring in not just the first law of thermodynamics, but the second law, in order to construct a theory of non-equilibrium a la Prigogine, and bring that into conversation with economics and say, the economics that we have is causing such devastation because of this unbelievable attachment to equilibrium, and it just needs to go. I was very happy when I heard Brian talking the other day, where he shifted his position slightly from his earlier work and said, he's not so sure it's reconcilable with neoclassical economics. So what's more important, I think, for for people who are working in sustainability, who have completely accepted in many more progressive circles non-equilibrium economics because it doesn't fit with their underlying sustainability science. What is now the biggest challenge is for them to rethink their politics. There is basically, this is a very hard and crude statement, but I'm going to make it anyway. There's basically no theory of the state in the bulk of the literature on sustainability transitions and in sustainability science in general. And there's a fundamental reason for that. And that is the sustainability challenge, if you accept it, requires you to do two things that are seemingly contradictory. You firstly have to accept complexity. But secondly, you have to accept the need for directionality. And these are very, very difficult to reconcile. Because if you're interested in directionality in a complex system, who's the primary agent that has the greatest impact on the system or the complexity, the complex of systems? And from a political science point of view, because ultimately that's what I am, it's about the state. But the state has been completely reinvented and reconstituted since the 1970s. There's a bit, and the shift in language just is the best way of grasping it. The shift in language is from government to governance. Government as structure, governance as relation. Just to put it very, very crudely. But in that shift, politics has been decentered and the state has been weakened. And we've got to the point where we accept now there's a poly crisis and we understand the nature of that poly crisis using complexity. But from my perspective, or people who see the world through my lens, kind of essentially a political economy or political science background, we are alarmed by what has now happened to the state. It's either being hollowed out by a new kleptomaniacal authoritarianism, or has been so fundamentally weakened, it can do absolutely nothing when it comes to directionality. And so you have to rebuild. But those kind of more progressive thinkers who take directionality seriously tend to emphasize the reconstitution of the state. And the only way you can do that is by reducing complexity. And are you going to be able to take the tentacles of octopus, put it all back into the box and go back to a kind of post-Second World War kind of progressive paternalistic welfarism? It's not going to happen. So how do you reconcile complexity and directionality? Bob Jessup, in my view, has tackled that head on, probably the only one really successfully, professor at Lancaster University. And he comes up with this phrase, this notion of collaboratory governance. So what he's identified around the world is that those more progressive political elites that are interested in directionality are starting to build a new generation of meta-governance institutions. So the basic definition of collaboratory governance is the governance of governance. So you accept relational governance as your point of departure. You don't have to join the band of people who think you can rebuild a powerful centralized state. Accept a relational governance, but you start to think of a new generation of governance institutions or meta-governance institutions in the business of the governance of governance. And the core capacity in those institutions is facilitation. So the traditional competencies in the state are regulation, taxation, policy, and enforcement. The fifth competency in collaboratory governance is facilitation. Facilitating the interactions between a multiplicity of stakeholders within the public sector and outside the public sector to create a new set of agreements that really are motivated by a conception of future long-termism directionality. So it's within the kind of collaboratory governance of non-equilibrium economics within an overall framework of an integral critical complexity. That's really the summary of where I've got to up until this point. But there's still a key piece missing. And this is the piece that I believe the new commons literature begins to fill. Now, there's an old commons literature, and there's a new commons literature. The old commons literature is associated with the Nobel Prize winner, Elinor Ostrom. And that's essentially about institutional and governance arrangements that people put together to manage the commons understood as a natural resource. Whether it's a piece of land or a piece of ocean or a river or whatever it is, there's a long history of institutional collaboration and governance going very, very long way back in the way in which we've managed the commons as a species. But there's a new literature on the commons that is not interested in the commons as natural resource, but is interested in the commons as knowledge. And the mushrooming around the world of new collaborative commons, knowledge production as commons, which creates a shared resource, which is then downloaded by the multiplicity of members engaged in the kind of free labor to construct the commons into their particular entrepreneurial initiatives and businesses. So this happens at a big scale, whether it's Mozilla, or Wikipedia, or Linux, or Apache servers, or GNU, and there's a whole, and they all have a very similar structure. They have the commons, they have a foundation that kind of, a bit like yourself, kind of looks after and cares for and helps the components to kind of do their job. And then you have the workers who kind of download from the core and use the resources for commercial gain and so on and so forth, but not excessive. But there's also much smaller things driven with like blockchain and operating systems underneath, or the maker movements. So the maker movements is where people are loading up machine designs into your commons instead of patenting it. Everybody, all the kind of worker bees kind of build and add onto the kind of the basic designs, and then you can download them into your different contexts and adapt them and make stuff with the shared designs. Even IBM is starting to give up on the returns on patenting, saying, "I'll just throw it all into the commons, let everybody work on it." Tesla saying, "I'll put my patents into the public domain," etc. So the commons, this idea of a new economy around the construction of a knowledge commons with a new set of value chains is really, really interesting and spreading fast. As some of you know, I'm the chairperson of the Development Bank of Southern Africa. We're a state-owned bank. We spend about 30 billion a year. The top executives are really interested in this idea of investing in commons because it is an alternative for them to both state-centric and market-centric development. So let me kind of end off by linking this to the core issue of how does all of this now help us to understand what is really my really core passion, which is rethinking the nature of transition. In general, to cut a long story short, we face the distinct possibility of an unjust transition. We have the technologies now and the financial incentives to decarbonize. But that doesn't necessarily mean we're going to address the inequalities and the unequal world that we face. How do we link decarbonization, restoration of biodiversity, and the biggest social challenge in the world today, which is inequality? If you can deal with that challenge, you can start to talk about the difference or a progression from a deep transition to a more sustainable world, which is unequal, to a just transition, which is more sustainable and more equal. And the way I try to do that is to break away from the way most people understand transitions, which is they all look for single long wave dynamics that have happened in the past, whether they're techno-industrial or socio-metabolic or or socio-technical, and then they project those into the future. Why can't we have a multiplicity of transition dynamics which work asynchronistically with one another and coagulate around particular moments in historical time to give rise to different kinds of dynamics? And essentially that's what I try to do, and argue that we're at a very particular and specific historic moment. I don't have time to go into the four long-wave dynamics that I bring together in analyzing our current historic moment, but informed by a complexity perspective, informed by an understanding of the dynamics of change. I argue it's unlikely change is going to come about in the traditional ways as a storming of the Winter Palace, seizure of state power. It's unlikely to come about through incremental, minor, marginal shifts in a reformist way to create a green economy. What we are talking about is the dynamics of radical incrementalism. In the kind of Polanyian sense, there's disastrous stuff happening at one level, and on the other level, the double movement, there is extraordinary things happening all over the world, which are very relational, very context-specific, very subversive of the old binaries, very reflective of the relational self that I've been talking about, very much connected to the mobilization of knowledge and the construction of knowledge commons in order to draw down the new production and consumption processes that reflect a more sustainable world. In other words, anticipatory thinking becomes radical experimentation, where we live out our future visions in the experimentations in the context, rather than sitting in flip chart driven facilitation processes where we imagine futures and hope everybody does something about it. It's actually doing stuff in the present that shapes the future. So I'd like to end off with a quote about incrementalism, which comes from Roberta Unger, the Harvard law professor who, for some, is like Robert Rosen. Why nobody talks more about these two characters, I don't know. But Roberta Unger has this passionate hatred for structure fetishism. Because he is deeply in love with human agency and our capacity to coalesce into groups that can make a difference as an alternative to both traditional conceptions of revolution and old and outdated conceptions of reform. So I want to read this rather extensive quote because for me it captures in so many ways all the different dimensions of this argument. What I'm not touching on is a chapter I've recently written, which is using South Africa as a case study to analyze the rise of the backlash against these dynamics of change and transitions. A kind of new authoritarianism, populist authoritarianism, which mobilizes particular toxic forms of masculinity and profoundly destructive modes of racism in many other parts of the world. In our context, we had a very similar dynamics, but we have an authoritarianism that is not racist in the traditional sense because we're majority black. But there are a set of dynamics, in particular with the way in which toxic masculinity is mobilized, that is deeply destructive. I don't have time to go in that, but I want to read this quote in order to end my argument because it brings together so many different threads. Structure fetishism, Roberta Unger argues, denies our power to change the quality as well as the content of our practices and institutions. The way in which the way in which we relate to our structure-defying and structure-changing freedom. Structure fetishism finds expression and defense in an idea, hallowed in the history of social thought, that opposes interludes of effervescence, charisma, mobilization, and energy to the ordinary raid of institutionalized routine. When, half asleep, we continue to act out the script written in the creative intervals. An extreme version of structure fetishism is the political via negative that celebrates rebellion against routinized institutional life as the indispensable opening to authentic freedom, while expecting that institutions will always fall again, Midas-like upon the insurgent spirit. Structure fetishism represents an unwarranted denial of our power to change society and therefore ourselves. So my overall conclusion, coming back to my point of departure, context and relatedness, or the relational self or relationality, is that the kind of research that connects our graduates, that connects our researchers to real world contexts, to interrogate what is specific about the local context, links those to interventions and research that builds experimental alternatives, informed by, to use Braidotti's words, a vision that is worthy of the present, is really what I think is the challenge of our generation, especially in the context where we are at this moment in our time.
Very interesting indeed. Thank you very much. I had just one comment and then a kind of big question, which is one I held for myself. The comment was interesting, and it's a longer conversation, is I don't theorize complexity and directionality as different. I see directionality as a necessary conclusion out of a world of increasing returns. So I wouldn't have put it in those terms, but it's a longer conversation. The other thing that was striking me with your focus on the state was climate change is global, and the role of big business. That big business, global business, seems to have more power in the world than anything else at the moment, and is kind of essentially unregulated, can dive here and be corrupt there and do a deal there. And the real issue, and I don't disagree with the at all with the idea of regulation, but I wonder what global governance means when we have global information, global climate change, and global business. How can we collectively, in some sense, state and non-state, work to create some form of global governance? That's so.
Yeah. So just on the first point, analytically and theoretically, you can reconcile directionality and complexity, but in the real world, it has to be translated into agency. And the problem with theories of the state is that most theories of the state don't make a distinction between the state as idea and state as reality. The state as idea is a powerful force that you can just hitch onto any theory whenever you're looking for directionality. And it's nice and convenient and neat with a very long history. But state as reality doesn't exist. The state is a messy, complex ensemble of disconnected institutions that rarely act in concert with one another, and has to kind of get organized in the same way that you would go out to organize a business sector or a village. And so once you make that, once you give up on the state as idea and you accept state as an ensemble or as whatever you want to call it, assemblage, you're then into complexity. And for Bob, and for Bob Jessup, and people who work within this framework, he talks about the strategic relational approach, the SRA, the strategic relational approach to doing, if you like, empirical analysis of the capabilities, potentials, capacities of a multiplicity of state institutions rather than referring to the potential of the state. So just at what level of analysis once it's reconciling directionality and complexity. If you don't think governance, the state has got any role, then you've got a real problem in thinking about directionality. And that links to your second question, where a lot of people give up on the national state and they look at global governance. So a lot of my own work is on the global financial system. So the global financial system is what enables corporates to operate in the way that they do. And that global financial system is extremely shaky. The debt levels are higher than they were before 2007. And a lot of people are talking about another global financial crisis at a time when states don't have the capacity to bail out the banks once again. And there's speculation on where it's going to start, whether it's China or wherever. What I'm interested in is the emergence of a new set of financial institutions in anticipation of some kind of meltdown or breakup. Those are developed. Over the last 10 years, there's been a massive rise in development finance institutions all around the world. These are publicly owned banks. The role of sovereign wealth funds, which are long-termist, the role of cooperative banks or non-profit banks, banks like other kinds of banks like Triodos, and of course blockchain and the new kinds of currencies and all the potential that creates. I don't think we can talk about global governance as a kind of imposition at the global level of our old conception of the state. That's just not going to work. But we can talk about a multiplicity of institutional configurations that gradually creates the potential for alternative forms of finance to coalesce around alternative forms of production and consumption. And that's a very different, that's a much more, if you like, complexity perspective on alternative economic futures than those who have faith in the possibility of a progressive nation state reorganizing national economies and then coalescing into some partnership at a global level to kind of discipline global capitalism when the financial institutions are just incentivizing extraction and destruction.
Thank you. I'm going to put down my hat as moderator and I'm going to ask Brian a question on the link between, I'm trying to link the talks between Mark and the notion of algorithms. So it seems that if we think about directionality, it seems that there might be a kind of a notion of directionality embedded in algorithms. To what extent is the economic system and what we think of, what we call the business system, directed maybe by algorithms? Or not directed, but what role, even in future, would algorithms play in shaping the economic system?
I don't know. Some comments. I very much liked your talk, and since I've come here to South Africa, I've been told repeatedly I'm American, but I grew up in Northern Ireland, and I left when the British Army moved in the same week to occupy us, so I have some personal idea. And from there I went to Berkeley, where the Vietnam War was raging. So I have a lot of, I would cheer on this idea that you're thinking very deeply about system change, and from a very relational point of view. As to algorithms, I didn't want to get caught up in the sort of algorithms that lead to artificial intelligence or whatever. But quick comment is that, at least where I live, but I'm pretty sure here as well, the economy would and could close down if algorithms stopped working, that they run everything at the moment, not just internet commerce, but they run everything. And I don't mean this in a bad way, for better or worse. Where I work, which is Xerox PARC, it's a tech company, they only do one thing these days, and that's artificial intelligence, and, well, as well as machine learning. That's the dominant force in Silicon Valley. It is with Google, it is with Facebook. We see a front end. But algorithms, meaning automated, autonomous systems that are making decisions all the time, are changing the economy. And I've written one or two essays, they're online, which basically argues that all these autonomous systems are pushing people out of work. I'm not the first person to argue that. And as people are thrown out of work, our view of the economy is changing. This may cheer you up, Mark. From the main problem of the economy is producing more and being more efficient. That's no longer the main problem. We have shifted into an era where the main problem is that of distribution. Who gets what? Who gets what access to this enormous trough that the autonomous economy is creating? And that's why we have populists taking over in Europe and taking over in America, and no doubt to some degree here too. But the linkage between my talk and Mark's, which I think is a pretty long chain, is something like this, that algorithms are redoing the economy so that human beings are much less necessary. And some people have pointed out that we had plenty of horses in the economy in 1900. We don't have those now, and the horses were never re-employed for anything else. So we're moving into a very heavily distributed regime, and that's affecting very deeply the politics. This is where this impinges on what you've been talking about. I can just put it very succinctly. With the advent of an autonomous / algorithmic economy, we are not in Kansas anymore. It's the American expression. Wizard of Oz, the world has changed, if you prefer that.
So can I just add to that? I mean, I to some extent argue against that pessimistic view. So the argument goes a bit like this. So I started thinking about this, and when I was trying to come to terms with the smart city agenda promoted by IBM and Cisco Systems and Siemens, etc., because I kind of work in the urban field, and I started to use the phrase algorithmic urbanism, which is really refers to as societies become more complex, we have found ways of managing that complexity, and that's algorithms. Without algorithms, we have to massively reduce complexity and return to hierarchical power to manage large systems. So algorithmic governance is here to stay. However, there's two different ways of looking at it. One way is the gradual algorithmic economies results in the marginalization of people. And that is giving rise to the kind of pessimism and hopelessness that underpins the rise of the populist writing, the populist authoritarianism. I agree with that overall analysis. However, it doesn't adequately take into account the alternative, which is the same sets of technologies, the same sets of algorithmic governance mechanisms are also underpinning the rapid expansion and accumulation of commons. These new commons economies are highly dependent on on open source. So the kind of radicals who operate within the coding world talk about loading code, algorithms, into the public domain, so that there's a multiplicity of worker bees who kind of add and develop and evolve, like Linux, the code, in a way that then creates a kind of a new public wealth, a new public resource, which, if you organize society and dynamics in certain ways, can rebuild and create a completely new set of value chains. Now, the language, you can see I'm struggling with this language because it's very, very new. And in the South African context, where there's virtually nothing of this kind of stuff, it's totally foreign to our ears. You use this language in certain parts of Europe, especially the Netherlands, 1 or 2 little square kilometers in the US. And in a place like Nairobi, people understand it. You know, I find that people can relate to what I'm talking about. So I think in the South African context, I think we are going to be forced to think about these things because of our massive unemployment problem. Our economy is not going to deliver if we don't fundamentally restructure it. And these commons instruments, these new commons economies, are our way of doing it, because I can't see another way.
Don't disagree at all, I think. Very good.
Megan and Mr. Ukama, my question was actually about what you think about how to think about the dangers of this algorithmic thinking. So I think the points that you both just made touch on both the potentials but also the dangers and the way that algorithmic thinking might encroach on maybe like thinking about our biology, you know, is as the transhumanists are doing and are exploring. So I think it's important to also consider what might the dangers be. And I don't know if you, Mark, said some of those, and in terms of the economy, but also what in terms of the question what it means to be human if we're thinking algorithmically.
Well, maybe that'll be Mark's next book. I mean this seriously. This is a huge.
Too depressing.
Yeah, it's an absolutely huge question. What I want to do is not point to algorithms and say Facebook is collecting data on us and using that, etc. I take all that as given. I don't like it. I do live in this 1 or 2 kilometers in Silicon Valley, Santa Clara County. But what I wanted to point out in my talk was that the language of expression in science is changing. Or if you say that we are in little capsules, I've often liked this idea, mathematically we're in some sort of topological space in a tiny little capsule where we're exploring forward using whatever methods our intellect is at hand. We have a new set of tools to use, and those are algorithms. We're basically now able to say, we can't encompass biology within mathematics or standard mathematics, standard algebra very easily. However, what we can do is to say there's another type of mathematics, an algorithmically based Greg Chaitin type, and all of biology easily fits, not all of biology, but we can formalize biology much better in that sort of mathematics. So we now have a new language. Whether that language is positive or negative or good or bad, I don't know. I will tell you this. What I didn't talk about was a very deep immersion for several months in the history of the changeover from geometry to algebra, you would not believe the hostility, the feeling of effrontery that we could take nature and humanism and reduce it to equations. Unbelievable. So I'm all for humanism. My co-speaker here sounds to me all for humanism. But we do have a new language or a new set of instruments.
Yeah, I mean that's like also a very personal issue. My son Ray was one of my students, and he finished his master's degree on a topic which was very close to my heart, which was Chinese investment in African oil. And immediately after graduating, he decided to move to London to become a coder. So I said, what is this about? He said, hey Dad, this is the language of the 21st century. And he's right. It is a new language. And they go off and they go to coding school and learn the new language. And that's a ticket into the new economy. So it's like, yeah, it's, and I don't think we understand it, most of us.
Okay, I'm going to allow one more question. Sorry, Mark. Carol?
Well, I hope, I really enjoyed, it's been wonderful, the 4 talks. But I'm wanting to pick up on the issue of structure fetishism. And try and sort of raise it to some of the issues that you were raising, in terms of inequality, the new economy, surplus population in a new form, etc. And it seems, and how one can, because so much of the conversation, and I'm sort of, my mind's buzzing all over the place, has been around flows and complexity and dynamism. But how do we conceptualize, we've talked about stasis a little bit, but what I'm thinking of more sort of sedimentation perhaps, and I understand the concerns about, this kind of notion of structure as something that's reified. But how do we understand where we are in this part of the world anyway, without some understanding of structural forces? And we talk about structural unemployment, what do we mean by that? I'm just thinking about just transitions and energy transitions, something like the idea, like Sumi's working on this, the minerals energy complex, which you can see as a kind of, there's something structural happening there. So it's a question to the panel perhaps, but also to you, Mark, in terms of your, I appreciate the commitment to agency, but how do we understand structure? Structuration doesn't quite get it right.
No. Well, as Louis Althusser once said, maybe I'm going to stick too far in the other direction. But so I suppose the thing that worries me about structure, especially in the context of the increasing radicalization within our society, but also across the continent, is a belief in stages of history. That somehow we go through, that the only significant change, or the only change that has significance, is when a structure changes. When you go from feudalism to capitalism to socialism as structure. So my antipathy, I suppose, to structure is because of its dominance. It leads to a denigration or a devaluation of a multiplicity of change dynamics, which are significant in and of themselves. And this is an old South African conversation. Before 1994, when there was still a belief that there could be a revolution, the only significance of a multiplicity of changes and experiments going on as people negotiated deals around changing Elizabeth or Johannesburg or whatever, was that the only thing that was significant is that you were contributing to the build-up of a revolutionary movement that at some point in the distant future, which the vanguard would decide on, would detonate the collapse of capitalism. And all the other change dynamics were just devalued in relation to that conception of change. So really, I think of structure in the context of what's our theory of change. What you are talking about is structures of power, in the way in which the mineral energy complex works, the way the financial system works, the way regulatory regimes operate with respect to the distribution and maldistribution of resources. I'm less worried about that. I'm very, very worried about what is an increasingly widespread conception even now. Look at how many young people didn't vote yesterday. That, listen, we've tried changing the system, didn't work, so now we must collapse it, we must destroy it. And that's based on a very particular concept of structure and change and agency. And I worry about that. That's where I'm coming from.
A quick word on that. When I read 19th century economists like Marx, great respect for how brilliant an economist he was, and others, there's a kind of all or nothing that Marx is referring to, that these huge changes in technology coming of the Industrial Revolution changes the structure of the economy. I spent many years looking at the history of technology and how technology evolves, and wrote a book about it. And what strikes me is that there are huge changes in technology. For example, now we have computation, or whatever you want to call that. Before that, we had mass production. We've had steam engines and so on, and they changed the whole, if you want to call it, structure of the economy. I prefer to use the word organization of the economy. But if you look at technologies, it's not that simple. It's much more fractal or fractured. There are important technologies like the steam engine. There's less important ones, say like the telegraph system in the 1840s. There's even very small changes. And so technology, or the means by which we organize our economy, it's not just technology, it's institutions, are changing all the time at all levels. That's kind of what I'm getting from what you're saying. We have to respect that there's change all the way at all times in institutions, the way we and in technologies, and in our behavior, and in our understanding, and in our culture, and our governance systems. And so we can't really say, when I first went to Berkeley, it was very Marxist, and I thought, I don't feel comfortable here. I think it was just a feeling that there's much more complicated set of changes going on all the time, and that will never stop. So we need to get a reaction to that, which I think is roughly what you're talking about, Mark, where we acknowledge that the world is made up of many, many overlapping, possibly competing systems that keep changing the ground under our feet. And the best we can do, I think, is to try to see a little bit ahead and see what we can organize to adapt to that and possibly help steer it in some benign way.
I'm going to just, thank you very much for your responses to that question. Just, we've been making time as we're going, so we are running late, but I appreciate your energy. I feel that there's an energy in the room, and also willingness for people to remain and to converse. So thank you very much for that. It's also a rare moment to have these kinds of conversations in the room. But I'm going to just ask our other two speakers, Yanni and Jean, also just a moment to reflect, or to maybe just give one or two last reflections on on the themes and how whether they wanted to maybe also respond to any of the questions in general.
So I wanted to give a slightly different answer to your question there. One of the things that intrigued me, and there's a chapter on this in, she points to Embracing Complexity, which builds on the idea of the life cycle of a forest. And what it's made me think about with complex systems is there are times when things are very chaotic. There's very little structuring, patterning at all. And so the role of change in that situation might be to help to cohere together emerging shoots or areas of relative stability and functioning. There are times when complex systems have, the way we've tended to describe it, a number of kind of overlapping and interlaying and interacting patterns where we theorize about that complex world as how do we kind of, interweave and understand and connect with those varying and various emerging patterns. There's then a third area that we call lock-in, where what happens, and it's the same in forests, that over time a forest becomes efficient in the sense of it has a lot fewer species in the forest, and their interrelationships in terms of who eats who and how they reproduce is not very varying. So if there's a change to the outer context of the forest, it tends to collapse. Now, one of the ways I think about structuring, and I also don't quite use that word, but there are situations in the world that are really locked in. So I've done some work in Israel and the occupied territories. And, if you want to go somewhere that feels very locked in, that's what I feel. It has a locked-in economy, it has a locked-in discourse as to who's good and who's bad and who's doing what. That feels very rigid. Now, I don't know the answer to this, but if we then thought about, well, how do we change those kind of really tight structures that really have not much wobble and variation in them, is that a different approach to change and to thinking about it than something that's more kind of fluid and interlaid and open? So that's how I would answer that question, and I think we have to think about that. There's a very good book written called The 5%, which tries to address that kind of question of what do you do with really tough locked-in questions. So that was and just another comment back, which was really about you talk about reducing complexity. I don't see it that way. I think we have complexity whether we view it or not. We can try and stamp on it, but it's kind of is still there. And a lot of what goes on in the world is when that complexity rears its head again. And so again, it's a question of language, but I don't tend to think of reducing it. I tend to think about whether we try and have power over it, but maybe it still survives. But just to say for me, before I hand over to Yanni, this has been so rich and interesting, and I'm so grateful and delighted to be here, and I feel buzzing with all of this. And if any of you want to be in touch with me, I'm sure Brian and the rest of us would say the same. Please be in touch with your kind of questions or comments, or have you read this, or how does this fit? Because it's how I learn and grow in this field. So thank you.
Really, so I must just correct this. I wasn't arguing that for the idea of reducing complexity. I was just arguing that if you want to re-establish the state in a traditional sense, that can only happen if you think it's possible to reduce complexity. If you accept that you can't reduce complexity and you still retain the conception of a traditional state, you're in trouble, because that traditional conception of the state actually is kind of irreconcilable. That's why we shifted from government to governance. So all I'm suggesting is not the exact opposite of what you're suggesting. I'm saying that we have to accept we can't reduce complexity, but we do need directionality given the nature of the crisis. And therefore we need to rethink governance institutions in a way that's appropriate to actually expanded complexity rather than the kind of algorithmized complexity that has been created by the big tech giants.
So if I may say something, perhaps in response to Brian's discussion of algorithms, the one thing I didn't get into is whether you can compute a complex system, either with equations or with algorithms. And of course, I agree that algorithms give you a much richer way of treating systems, and especially with conditions, and so it's a much easier way to describe many things. The snag is an algorithm that tries to capture what I think we do agree, that a part of complexity is the self-reflection, this what I call impredicativity, this definition in terms of itself. Algorithms cannot capture that. An algorithm that tries to capture that either doesn't start or it doesn't halt. There's a big problem. Turing realized all of this. So you can capture a lot with algorithms. An algorithm can write a description of itself, but it cannot become a functional algorithm. Again, any algorithm runs in an interpretive environment, and the algorithm can create a description of itself, but it cannot functionalize itself. It needs, again, that interpretive environment. So if you want to capture the whole thing, you have to actually have the algorithm create the interpretive environment. I've done this I've created a formal system, or I tried to create a formal system that can write its own rules, which would be like the cell. The cell creates its own. And I could show it cannot do it. You need something from the outside, which the cell has actually pulled inside. So we can have an argument about this, but algorithms are not rich enough to capture impredicative systems.
Well, von Neumann would disagree with you around 1950, he thought about and designed a system of reproductive automata. His system was totally and utterly algorithmic. So I
absolutely agree. I'll send you a paper in which I show that von Neumann has. Rosen actually pointed to a paradox in von Neumann's, but the paradox is wrong. I mean, Rosen was wrong there, but his contention wasn't wrong. So I'll send you a paper in which I show that von Neumann's self-reproducing automaton is not fully algorithmic. I'm cheered up to hear that Rosen is wrong about von Neumann being wrong. So the point is, you don't criticize von Neumann. Eh? That was a big problem. So Rosen was just after his PhD, he wrote this paper. And he was exercised for that. I mean, you don't do that. You don't criticize von Neumann. I did.
A last word?
Oh, last word.
A last word?
Yeah, I have a quick last word that I thought it was. I'm really grateful to Rika for organizing this, and I thought it was an absolutely, looking for words, possibly insightful or very informative morning. I enjoyed all 3 talks that I wasn't part of, and I certainly enjoyed Yanni's talk very, very much. What strikes me most of all is that in different contexts and in different language, we are talking much about the same thing. And I do think we're under an enormous set of changes in science, or if you prefer, in the way we are looking at the world, or in our ontology, if I got that right, Jean. We're in a state of transition that's slow and almost unnoticeable. One thing I would like to say is that the views that have come out this morning are not so much driving these changes. They're symptomatic. Complexity, I think, is coming out of these changes rather than driving these changes. I thought it, anyway, thank you, the 3 of you, really brilliant, and thank you for listening, everybody.
Yeah, thanks, Rita, for organizing this on behalf of CST. For some of us who started as John sitting there in the back, quiet as usual. When some of us started imagining the possibility of a center like this at CST 15 years ago, at a workshop with Basraf Nicolescu and Manfred Nicolescu, 2005, I don't know which month. The notion that Stellenbosch University would ask a systems biologist and a kind of laxed political economist come political ecologist to set up what they call the flagship research initiative would have been absolutely unthinkable. It's happened. And I was just sitting there in the corner thinking to myself that actually 15 years ago, this was the kind of discussion we dreamed about having. And to kind of imagine that we are now having it is just extraordinary. My only wish is that it kind of broadens out into incorporating into the conversation narratives from the sub-Saharan or the African context, which might not always be expressed in the same categories, but are saying the same things. And what CST has now got kind of 70 million rands worth of research projects underway, excluding salaries, and it's clearly there's an energy that is bringing together an extraordinary group of people to think about the connections between all of these incredible issues. So it's a very, very exciting place to be. Thank you.
Great. Thank you to our speakers and thank you to our audience for being patiently energetic and present. Thank you very much.